Hello, it is November 30th, 2023. I'm Kathleen Newman from Maine Historical Society. Thanks so much for joining us for another virtual program. As we approach the last month of our landmark exhibition, Code Red, which examines topics around the climate and biodiversity crisis, we felt it would only be fitting to take some time to reflect on what we've learned. Um, and to look forward and envision what comes next. So tonight, we have joining us Bill McKibben and MHS's Executive Director Steve Bromage to join in conversation as we consider Maine's pivotal role in the modern environmental movement and the actions that we can all take part in to be a part of this positive legacy. Now, before we go any further, let's take a moment just to acknowledge and remember that Maine Historical Society recognizes what is currently referred to as Maine is Wabanaki homelands, a place the Wabanaki people have stewarded for over 13,000 years. Wherever we are in Maine, we are on Wabanaki homelands. We recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we're committed to helping provide education about this history through partnerships with Wabanaki people. And our exhibit, Code Red, is a really excellent example of one of those partnerships. Code Red is going to be open for one more month. You can visit it up through December 30th. So if you haven't had a chance to, we'd love to see you at our campus in Portland. And I'll share some more information on how you can do that in the chat shortly. So joining us tonight is Bill McKibben, an author, educator, and environmentalist who helped found 350.org, the first global grassroots climate campaign, and recently helped found Third Act to help build a progressive organizing movement for people over the age of 60. He's a contributing writer to The New Yorker and serves as the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. In 2014, he was awarded the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, in the Swedish Parliament. He's also won the Gandhi Peace Award and honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities. He's written over a dozen books about the environment, including his first, The End of Nature, published in 1989, and his latest book is The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. So, Bill McKibben and, of course, Steve Bromage, thank you both so much for being here tonight.
A great pleasure to get to join you all, and greetings from Vermont.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, it's my pleasure to welcome Bill McKibben to MHS too. We were so fortunate to be joined by an environmental thinker of Bill's knowledge, experience, and stature. And I have to say, Bill, Kathleen mentioned End of Nature. You introduced me, of course, to climate change as a concept when End of Nature was published, and I was working in publishing as my first job out of college. And the one perk, you're making about $14,000 a year, but your one perk is book swaps. And the only book I ever requested from another editorial assistant was End of Nature when it came out in trade paperback. So it's always stuck with me, and I've always followed you since that moment. So it's great to have the chance to talk.
Good stuff.
Yeah. So we deeply appreciate Bill not just being here to participate in tonight's program, but his contributions to Code Red, the exhibition that Kathleen mentioned. Code Red really continues a series of exhibitions MHS has done over the last 6 or 7 years, which really look at what's going on in Maine today and how can we use our tremendous resources in history to provide context. Everything we care and we know and love about Maine is shaped profoundly by its history. And so that's, I think, a unique role that we can and play. So, clearly few things impact Maine today like climate and climate change. So, Bill, thanks again and welcome. Welcome.
Very good to be with you.
Yeah. So I would love to get to kind of frame the beginning of our conversations actually talking about Maine specifically a little bit. And I think, on one hand, we all know climate change clearly has dire global human consequences. I think it also poses a significant risk to something that is near and dear to every one of us on the program tonight, and that's Maine and its special sense of place. I think Maine's identity is shaped so profoundly by its northern climate and the particular species and fauna that live here and that find Maine habitable as it has been and as we're going. So as we lose those plants and those trees and the lobsters crawl down east, frankly, Maine's not going to be recognizable as Maine anymore. And pretty soon we're going to have a climate of a mid-Atlantic state, which I think is pretty scary and motivating for all of us who really feel ownership and responsibility and stewardship for Maine. So I think, we can see it happening around us, and it puts something we care a lot about at risk. So I'd love to just kind of start and get a sense, learn whether you've had the chance to spend much time in Maine and what your experiences and observations have been of your time in Maine.
Yes, indeed. I grew up in Massachusetts, and we would spend the summers vacationing in Maine, a couple of weeks anyway, a summer up in Rangeley. And then my brother ended up going to the university at Farmington and spent the rest of his life in Maine. He was a school teacher for many years out on Matinicus, and now in his retirement from school teaching, he's back on Matinicus, working full time as a sternman on a lobster boat. So Maine is deep in his blood, and as a result a little bit in mine too. It's one of my favorite places in the world to come, and it's been really fun to watch it go through all kinds of interesting evolutions over the years, and now to see Portland emerge as one of the great cities in America, and just on and on and on. It's really fun. But I've wandered every inch of, well, not every inch of Maine, but I've wandered up and down Maine with great pleasure, from Madawaska in the north to the bridge, and so I love the state. If I didn't love Vermont so much, that might be where I was. But and it is, as you say, painful to imagine many of the iconic things about the state of Maine beginning to shift in profound ways. If you had to pick two examples, one might be those lobsters that my brother fishes on the Gulf of Maine. At the moment, that fishery is still pretty healthy, but all you have to do is look south to Massachusetts and Rhode Island and things to realize that that's not likely to last very long. The line has been moving steadily north, and if one was investing in lobster futures, I'm afraid you'd be looking to Nova Scotia and points north before too much longer. The other creature that I love, one of the many creatures that I love in Maine, is the moose. And to watch the moose herd reduced dramatically by the fact that shorter winters have produced a huge increase in the number of ticks, and you have moose now, autopsied with 70,000 ticks on their hide, just sucking them dry. That's just sad and pathetic. The climate change is by far the biggest thing that human beings have ever done. Nothing else even comes close to changing the temperature of the earth where we live. So every place around the world is in a state of chaotic and violent flux. In one sense, we're lucky in having a certain amount of wealth and resources to cushion us that other parts of the world don't. But I do think that maybe it hits hardest, most profoundly in places where we have a deep love and affection for the world around us, not in the kind of suburban nowhere that's much of America. But Maine and Vermont are the two most rural states in the Union. And so people are deeply attached to the things around them. And that's one of the reasons that it's so poignant to watch this change coming at the pace it's coming.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? What is it we see around us in black and white? Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we had our annual meeting up in Bar Harbor at the Abbey Museum, and the former head of Friends of Acadia gave a really great talk, and he was describing there's a spot out in one of the harbors there called Bunker Ledge, and it's the place where every year out on the water you come, and at low tide the seals are there, and it is just such a fundamental part. And he was describing the impact of sea rise, and in just a couple of years, all of a sudden that touchstone for so many people won't be there. So it's interesting, this kind of theme of what clicks for us and makes it sink in and drives us to action.
Well, one of the things, of course, right now, we're in that moment in the year as it wheels in toward winter. And winter is obviously, an endangered species at this latitude. We already have markedly shorter winters measured by the frost dates, and they're set to get much shorter still. And to me, that's emblematic of the sadness that comes with. It's not the thing in the world that's the most damaging, I guess, but I love winter above all seasons. This time when, for a few months, friction gives up its grip on the planet, and we're able at this latitude to just kind of slide across the surface. And we figured out so many pleasurable ways to do that, and it's whimsical and magic. But that magic is beginning to evaporate, and it should be a reminder to us not only to do everything we can about climate change, and we'll talk about that, but also a reminder to never take a snowstorm for granted, and get out and enjoy every bit of it that we possibly can, um, because, well, because because nothing is reliable anymore in the way that it once was.
Yeah. Before we kind of dive into the current moment in action and issues, something that really strikes me profoundly about history, about Maine history, that I wonder of its value as a lesson and example. I look at the emergence of the environmental movement, in the 1950s and 60s, and it strikes me, that was a moment in time where Maine was in really awful straits. The state of our rivers, forests, there's so much effluent and pollution going into the rivers that a broad group of people came together and said, wait a second, we can't eat the fish, we can't recreate, we can't swim, the forests aren't healthy. And really across industry and background, people came together and said something precious was at stake, which led to, eventually Senator Muskie's work in the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. And then over the last 50 or 60 years, in some ways, the success of the environmental movement has been an incredible human success. And if it weren't for this climate change that we're now facing, and to me, the power of that is we've really rewired our brains in a lot of ways over 50, 60 years, and there are all kinds of behaviors that we have changed. So I'd be interested in your perspective as we face these new escalating risks about the power of that example as a guide that we can change behavior and that we can take action and we can do what we need to do.
Well, first of all, you're bearing the lead about Maine and its history and the environment. I mean, between the Nearings and then the, Rachel Carson was the single most important person in the history of the environmental movement, at least until Greta Thunberg came along, and largely because of her connection to Maine and its coast and understanding its place. You're right. The work that people did in the 1960s to really start us on a new relationship with the world around us was profoundly important. And some of that had obviously been in Maine even before. I mean, Percival Baxter's decision to uh, uh, preserve Katahdin is a kind of early example of the sort of foresight that's was an American hallmark. Um, and I think we may have thought that after the first day, Earth Day, with the passage of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and things, that we were well on our way to doing some of the work we needed to do. As it turns out, that was the easy part, because it didn't require that much in the way of change. You just needed a new filter on the back of your car, or on the top of your smokestack, or on the end of your effluent pipe, or whatever. We didn't understand that the deeper danger came from things operating more or less as we assumed they should, just at too great a volume. So a clean and burning engine was one that just released CO2 and water vapor, until we figured out that CO2 in volume was enough to heat the planet and melt the poles. And that's where we are now. The reason that this fight is so tough now is that we're no longer asking polluters to do some work around the edges to clean up. Now we're telling the oil industry that it actually has to stop producing its product. As the Secretary General of the UN said last summer to the oil industry, your core product is our core problem. And there's no way to square this circle, to make things work without that kind of change. The good news is that we're capable of that kind of change. In the last 10 years, engineers around the world have dropped the price of renewable energy 90%. We now live on a planet where the two cheapest ways to produce power are to point a sheet of glass at the sun and to put up a windmill. And so there's no deep technological or financial obstacle to making rapid progress. There's just the power of business as usual, mostly represented by the fossil fuel industry, but also represented by things like our aesthetic choices about what we want to look at, and so on and so forth. So it's a truly, truly interesting moment. And it's good to see Maine starting to take really powerful steps in this direction. This the legislation that came through Augusta last year, with everybody signing off on development of offshore wind, and how it's going to be done, and how it's going to be done in ways that protect fishermen and things, is really, really powerful. And it may turn out that, in the same way that Texas had oil, Maine has wind that can help us power our economy, but more importantly, preserve our world. Not without a certain amount of trade-offs, but nothing like the trade-offs that go with losing winter, say.
So that kind of, you mentioned the fossil fuel industry. That was been a big focus of 350.org. So where's the balance of the economic dynamics of the businesses versus the will of the people? How do those things, as again we kind of look at individual action, how do those two things
Yeah.
come together?
Well, that's a very good question. So, I wrote The End of Nature in 1988. It was the first book about what we then called the greenhouse effect. And at the time, I thought that just writing books about this would be enough. If we won the argument, then our leaders would do the right thing. Why wouldn't they? Scientists had outlined the gravest threat to our civilization that had yet emerged. It took me 10 years, something, of writing more books and having symposiums and giving talks and stuff, to understand that we'd won the argument, but we were losing the fight, because the fight wasn't about reason and data and evidence. The fight was about what fights are normally about: money and power. And the other side in this fight, the fossil fuel industry, had so much money and had so much power that they were able to keep their business model up and running, even as everybody acknowledged that it was destroying the planet. So that's why we started organizing and building movements to try to build some power of our own. If you don't have billions of dollars, then movements depend on people and their creativity and spirit and willingness to engage. And 350.org was the first iteration of that. Beginning here in Vermont, we quickly built out a global network that's had, I think now we think about 20,000 demonstrations in every country on earth except North Korea. We helped spearhead the campaign to block the Keystone Pipeline. And then we launched this massive fossil fuel divestment campaign that, among other things, Maine's pension fund is now a part of. And it's been exciting to, I mean, in fact, the very first institution on the planet to divest itself from fossil fuels was tiny Unity College in Unity, Maine. Also an important place because that's where Jimmy Carter's solar panels ended up when Ronald Reagan ripped them off the White House. So that movement has kept building, and it's drawn in many, many, many people who have gone on to do even more remarkable things. The young people who started out as divestment campaigners then founded this thing called the Sunrise Movement that brought us the Green New Deal. And that, shrunken down by Congress, was the Inflation Reduction Act that finally is allowing the deployment of clean energy at scale. And then, around the world, young people began picking up on all of this. And most prominently, Greta Thunberg, one of my favorite people on earth to work with. I quite adore her, but she'd be the first to say there are 10,000 Gretas scattered across the planet, and they have 10 million followers. That's how many kids were out on school strike in September of 2019. It's been wonderful to watch this movement rise up, but at the same time, the fossil fuel industry has done everything in its power to prevent the change that we desperately need. We now know from great investigative reporting that they knew everything there was to know about climate change back in the 1980s when I was writing this first book about it. Exxon scientists told them what the temperature was going to be in 2020, and their executives believed them. Exxon started building all their drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming, a fact that never fails to amaze me. But they didn't tell the rest of us. Instead, they hired everybody from the tobacco industry and started in on this 30-year campaign of denial and delay and disinformation that's cost us 30 years and left us behind the 8 ball now. So at this point, very important that we don't just leave all this work to the next generation to solve. A, it's not fair, it's pretty ignoble. And B, it's not practical. We have a very limited time to deal with this. And young people, for all their intelligence and idealism and energy, lack the structural power to make change on the scale we need in the time that we have. That's why we've spent the last couple of years organizing Third Act, so that people with hairlines like ours start to play a larger role in backing those kids up. And it's been really fun to watch this spread quickly around the country. We've got many, 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 many tens of thousands of volunteers, including a wonderful chapter in Maine that's doing great work. And so we're going to give everybody we're going to give them as big a run for their money as we can. We don't know the outcome. And that's different from most fights. The reason we don't know what the outcome is going to be is because this is a timed test. And so I think, about, say, Dr. King, who would end speeches by quoting from the Massachusetts abolitionist Theodore Parker. He'd say, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice," i.e., this is going to take a while, but we're going to win. Well, the arc of the physical universe is short, and it bends toward heat, And if we don't win soon, then it's not like someone has a plan for refreezing the Arctic once we've melted it. Scientists have told us, the IPCC has told us, that we need to cut emissions in half by 2030, which by my watch is 6 years and 1 month away. So we better get cracking.
It struck me. I was back rereading End of Nature this weekend, and it struck me how fresh it was. But just you use that quote about the bending of the universe, and it really stood out to me, the immediacy and the logic, and it would have felt new to our culture 5 years ago, much less 30 years ago, but it just felt that immediate. So maybe we just step back. How did you initially get engaged and interested, engaged, active in environmental issues and climate interests?
Well, I mean, it wasn't really at all as a younger person. My first job in the world, 21, the week after I left college, I went to New York City to go to work for the New Yorker magazine, writing the Talk of the Town column and sort of doing out around the city, interviewing people. And it was very urban. And the things that really motivated me were things like the emerging homelessness crisis in New York and so on. But the first long piece that I wrote for the New Yorker, and in those days you could write very long pieces for them, was about where everything in my apartment came from. I followed all. I went down to Brazil because Con Ed was buying oil from Brazil, and I went up to Hydro-Quebec in James Bay and looked at the electric plants, and out in the Gulf of Mexico, and they were getting natural gas, and in the Grand Canyon where uranium was coming from for the nuclear reactor at Indian Point, and I followed the water system and the everything else, and it was very, very interesting. And one of the reasons that it was interesting was that it left me understanding in a way I hadn't before that we lived in a very physical world. Now, I'd grown up in the suburbs, which are kind of a way of hiding the physical operation of the planet. Who knows where the water flows or how anything works. And then I'd lived in Manhattan, which is a city that seems able to mint money and ideas out of thin air, But I'd come to understand how exquisitely reliant it was on the continued operation of a number of physical systems. And that, I think, allowed me to read the earliest science around climate change as it was just starting to emerge in the journals with a different sense than I would have before that. I mean, I really understood that this was potentially scary stuff. At the same time, at the age of 25 or 26, I left the New Yorker. They'd been bought by a big conglomerate, and they fired Mr. Sean, who'd been the editor for 40 years. So I was annoyed and quit and moved up to the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York, which are really the greatest wilderness of the American East. And I was living deep, deep in the woods and just falling in love with the wilderness, even at the same moment that I was understanding that in certain ways it wasn't quite wilderness anymore as we'd understood it. If you were changing the temperature of that place and hence the flora and, well, Thoreau once said, I can walk half an hour from my house and come to a place where no man stands from 1 year to another, and there consequently politics are not, for politics are but the cigar smoke of a man. Good line. And I could walk 5 minutes from my house in the Adirondacks and come to places I don't think anyone had ever stood. And yet, if the habits of a planet, if our economies and our emissions were changing the temperature of that place, and everything depends on temperature, then the cigar smoke of men was, always blowing in my face. And so when I wrote The End of Nature, it was part the first reporting about what was going on with this, but it was also a kind of essay about my dominant emotion at the time, which was a kind of sadness. Since then, as things have developed, I've come to have a great deal more fear for the future, especially since I have children and soon grandchildren, um, and a great deal more anger on behalf of people around the world whose lives are being cut short by all of this. But that sadness has lingered too. The sense that we'd taken this exquisitely wild and beautiful place and done it such central and critical damage.
So you said that kind of pace of going from learning and awareness and light bulbs going off to activism was a decade or so. It's interesting to think about your personal arc and then our societal arc, and how quickly people move and ideas move or don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish I'd figured it out sooner.
Yeah.
And that we'd gotten big movements going sooner. It wasn't really until the middle part of the first decade of this century, in about 2006 or 7 or so, that we really began organizing on the scale that we should have been. And it's been to some degree effective. We're beginning to catch up with the power of the fossil fuel industry, but so much damage has been done. Human beings have emitted more carbon since 1989 than in all of human history before it. And now we're, 2023 was, I'm afraid, the year that I was sort of fearing when I wrote The End of Nature. This was, by the beginning of the year, oceanographers were beginning to note that sea surface temperatures around the world were elevated to places they'd never been before. And by June, we were measuring the highest daily global average temperatures ever recorded. Now, our thermometers only take the record back a couple of hundred years, but scientists are very good at using proxies, glacial cores, lake sediments, and things to extend that much further. It's completely clear that midsummer 2023 Northern Hemisphere were the hottest days on the planet in at least 125,000 years. So, I mean, you're a historian. That takes us back almost before prehistory. That's no human civilization has ever dealt with a climate anything like the one we're now experiencing.
It was incredible to me, again, looking back at End of Nature, just what a powerful and accessible primer that was, kind of human history and pace and time. And, because I think so much of this is how do you get it to sink into people's heads? But there are a couple of there's a dimensionality about the way you wrote, and you talked about generations going back and how many generations, what's known in the human history. And it's not as long as endless as one would imagine. So that was one sense of scale that you gave me that was really valuable. And then the other one was talking about a mile or 2 miles or the distance up Mount Everest and what happens biologically and in our existence when you stand it up versus
Now, the sky
when you
seems
put it
like a big
horizontally.
place.
Yeah.
But it's actually not a very big place.
Yeah.
The sky is an exquisitely thin
Yeah.
layer. I mean, if the Earth is the size of an onion, then the atmosphere is the size of an onion skin. And that's what we've poured all this carbon into. It would be shocking if we weren't. I mean, think about what we've done. Basically, the story of climate change is in the course of a couple of centuries, and most of that in the last few decades, we've dug up several million years worth of biology, set it on fire, and put the resulting emissions into the atmosphere. It would be strange if it wasn't doing something dangerous and weird, and it is. And the only good news, as I said, is that we're now at the point which we couldn't have quite imagined in 1989, when we could quite easily desist from that combustion. Human beings have been setting things on fire for at least, I don't know, 700,000 years, I think is what the anthropologists sort of date early fire to. And it's been important in our development. Darwin said that language and fire were the two things that set humans apart. I mean, at first, it let us cook food, which was a part of the development of the big brain. It let us move north and south away from the equator. No one was going to live in Maine before someone could light a fire. Uh, and I think that they even think that some of the tight social bonds that mark our species come from many eons of standing around the campfire all night, that kind of proto-Zoom that human beings engaged in for a very long time. And then came the Industrial Revolution, and our ability to control the combustion of first coal and then oil and gas produced modernity, the world that we know around us. The trouble is that the benefits are quite suddenly being outweighed by the costs. We've talked about the biggest of those costs, the existential risk to climate, but that's not the only one. 9 million human beings a year die, that's one death in 5 on this planet, from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. If you've been to Delhi or someplace in recent years, that won't really surprise you. But in this country, hundreds of thousands of cases of childhood asthma every year just triggered from breathing the smoke. And of course, we know who gets to breathe that smoke. We know who gets to live next to the highway and the refinery and whatever else. And we've been reminded in the last few years of the other reason that it would be nice not to depend on resources that are only available in a few places. The people who control those few places end up with way more power than they should have. In our country, our biggest oil and gas barons were the Koch brothers, and they used their winnings to degrade and deform our democracy. In Europe, it's Vladimir Putin, and he's used his hydrocarbon cash to launch a land war in Europe in the 21st century. So it's very nice to think about bringing that combustion to a speedy end. The good Lord was kind enough to hang a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles up in the sky, and we now have the wit to make full use of it. We can capture its rays on photovoltaic panels, and we can take advantage of the fact that it differentially heats the earth, producing the breeze that turns those turbines. And now we have cheap batteries to store that solar power when the sun goes down and wind power when the wind drops. It's not a free lunch. We have to mine things like lithium and cobalt, and we should be able to do that better than we're doing it now. But the scale of the damage is minor compared to the unbelievable damage we're doing at the moment. Remember those 9 million people a year dying just from breathing this stuff. And remember, too, that renewable energy is a very different beast. I mean, yes, you have to go mine lithium, and then you put it in a battery and it does its work for 25 years. When you mine coal, you set it on fire, and then you have to go mine some more tomorrow. A way to kind of keep this in mind, especially for people who live along the coast, is that 40% of all the ship traffic on planet Earth is just carrying coal and oil and gas back and forth across the seas. Unnecessarily, because the sun is happy to deliver energy for free now every time it rises above the horizon. That's the great promise of the moment, but it's also the reason that this fight is so hard. Because if you're Exxon and you've made a fortune for 100 years by having people write you a check every month for a new delivery of energy, then the thought that the sun would do it for free is the stupidest business model you've ever heard of. And you'll do what you can to make sure that it doesn't happen. And, the power of these guys to play with our politics is enormous. Those of you in Maine got to watch just a little tiny bit of this when young people dared to suggest that perhaps the utilities in Maine might not need to be privately owned by people from outside of Maine. And you couldn't turn on the TV in Maine for 3 months without seeing a barrage of ads from, they outspent 35 to 1, those young people, in order to win that referendum.
It's interesting, so much, our economy, our world, our life is evolving so constantly. The economy is evolving constantly. It strikes me too, the opportunity around the renewables is one of vitality and reinvention by building those industries and creating those jobs. It's one that you're addressing all kinds of negative consequences, but you're also creating really positive ones
Oh,
about.
and I mean, and for Maine, a chance to recover much of its history as a maritime power. I mean, it's exciting to think of what the port's going to look like once it's bustling with people who are, going out to tend the windmills. Someone in the chat asks about your great new arrival in Maine, and my old dear friend Ayanna Johnson. Um, who, if Mainers don't know yet, I hope they soon will, because she is one of the great forces of nature in the whole United States. And as she points out, there's extraordinary possibility here for building a much more democratic, equitable, beautiful planet than the one we have now. The only caution is that we have to do it fast. uh, uh, any solution to climate change that is 30 or 40 years out isn't a solution, because yes, in 40 years we'll run the world on sun and wind because it's cheap. But if it takes us anything like 40 years to get there, then the world that we run on sun and wind will be a broken world. So that's the urgency. I mean, that's why, I mean, it's not, I don't enjoy going to jail or, whatever, but that's why people do it.
So that gets at what I think is a really important point. So this balance of the dire urgency of the need to act and act quickly, and the reality of human beings, and it can be paralyzing to think about the scale of the issues and the scale of what's required. A lot of people aren't revolutionaries; they're not activists, and they're committed. So how, in your work, do you balance communicating urgency, we have to act decisively now, with understanding the pace of human emotion or acculturation to the notion?
So movements have to be able to accommodate all kinds of different people, and have a broad scope of activities for people to engage in. So, for instance, at third act, we, do all kinds of things, train people up to work on their state public utility commissions to try and change policy, uh, um, help in election campaigns, referendum campaigns. And then sometimes there's people who decide that they want to push it further and be out in the street. We did this day of action in 100 cities across the country, including Portland, last March, where we were outside the big banks, Chase City, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that are the biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry. And it was great. We did sit-ins in a lot of places, but we're too old to sprawl on the sidewalk for 4 hours. So, in Washington, D.C., where I was, and there were thousands of us, we'd gone to the Goodwill stores all around the metro area and come away with hundreds of rocking chairs. And that's what we conducted we shut down the banks for the afternoon in what the New York Times the next day called a rocking chair rebellion. Um, um, so there's lots and lots and lots of different ways for people to get engaged. But I think the important thing to realize is you need to find some other people to do this with. The American default is always towards a kind of hyper individualism. And we think about a problem, and our immediate question is, what should I have in my roof? What should I have in my garage? So on and so forth. I mean, I'm happy and proud, I guess, that I have solar panels all over my roof and have had for decades, and they're connected to an EV in the garage, and on and on and on. But I don't try to fool myself that that's how we're going to solve this. We're past the point where we can square the climate math 1 Tesla at a time. The most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to make change. And as a historian, of course, that this idea of sort of big, broad social movements is a relatively recent invention. I mean, it's a kind of 20th century. It was, you know, Gandhi and the suffragists and things who kind of pioneered this work, and Dr. King and a million others in the civil rights movement who picked up on it. I mean, you can go back a little further. Mr. Thoreau, there in the Concord jailhouse for refusing to pay his taxes, and Ralph Waldo comes to say, "Henry, what are you doing in jail?" And Henry looks up at him and says, "Ralph, what are you doing out of jail?" So, but that's about as far back as you can take this sort of ideas around social change. We're still figuring them out, learning by example as we go along. There's a lot of work to be done.
It's interesting. That is one of the places where I think history can be really valuable, and again, just bringing it back to Maine and Maine's sense of place, which I just think is such a powerful force. It's an asset. It's a sense of connection, and I think it makes it's one of the things that's wonderful about here. People have such an appreciation, and I think there's a power for that. But it's interesting as we think about our work again at Maine Historical. So much of that is framed in where are we today and what makes Maine Maine, and seeing ourselves as stewards is over the long haul. And I think so it's a powerful force how much we all care about Maine from all kinds of different backgrounds. And so to me, I think the question is, what do we want Maine to look like in 10 years, 20 years, 40 years? How do we get everybody a seat at a table? And what is it that we cherish about Maine that we have to preserve and hold on and strengthen? And what are the things that we don't like about it that we have the opportunity to change? And history shows you things are constantly changing and evolving, which puts the power in our lap to be in control of the future.
That's very true, with two caveats. One is that Maine is no longer capable of controlling its own future by itself. Um, if we can't figure out a global solution to climate change, then we're all going to be overwhelmed by it. And that's just a sad fact. And I wish it weren't true, because I'd dearly love to just stay home in Vermont and work on this here. Um, um, and and the other corollary, as I said, is that we have to move quickly here. And our systems are not geared towards moving fast. Our political systems are geared toward delay and things. But Maine is showing some real interesting promise and change there. One of the things that's most interesting to me is watching how this public financing for campaign system is revitalizing democracy in Maine and starting to spread around the country. And you've had some great heroes emerge in recent years. My friend Chloe Maxman, um, who's now, helping lead a kind of revival of rural progressive politics across America, and who I knew as a high school student when she was fighting for climate justice, at the age of, I remember her having me up to give a talk at someplace, Sebago or something, and 20 some years ago. And I remember when she went to Harvard and led the campaign to divest Harvard from fossil fuel, and then came back to Maine and ran for the state house and the state senate, and against all odds managed to win. And these are all reminders that change really is possible, but it only comes if you push for it.
We have a question that's came in, kind of Indigenous leadership regarding social change organizing does Maine see happening? I guess in my mind too, that gets at the question of, I think one of the important themes in Code Red is this notion of indigenous science and leadership. Have you encountered or given much of that? I know, again, you're talking with pace and urgency, so we don't have generations to steward. We have to act quickly. But what has been your experience, impression of the indigenous science as a component of climate change or
around the
climate
world,
solution?
around the world, indigenous people are at the forefront of the climate movement and have been from the start. Um, you know, I got into the fight, say, about the Keystone Pipeline because Indigenous friends in Canada started writing me about what was going on in the tar sands in Alberta, where the pipeline was coming from. And, so you'll recall Standing Rock and the big fight over the encampment there, which I think surprised some Americans, but not me, because I'd known many of these people have been working, and groups like the Indigenous Environmental Network have been at the forefront. But it's not just here. I mean, I've gotten the chance to work all over the world and wherever you go, Australia, Oceania, South America, on and on and on. It's Indigenous people who are often in the very forefront and the most effective leaders. And one of the reasons is this science slash worldview that one way to look at where we are right now that I think is hopeful is that the oldest wisdom traditions on the planet, indigenous wisdom traditions, and the newest wisdom traditions, scientists with satellites and supercomputers, are converging in many ways on the same place. And the place where they're converging is telling the rest of us that what passes for conventional wisdom in this world, that we're just going to keep growing the economy forever, on and on and on, is nonsense. And I think that convergence is really, really interesting. I mean, the view from the sweat lodge and the view from the supercomputer are not far apart, and hopefully that'll translate into enough power to overcome the enormous power of the status quo and inertia to keep us where we are. But it's really, really important work, and the amazing leadership of indigenous communities is a sight to behold across the world.
The questioner also was asking about specific to Maine, which I know you might not have. I would just comment that Darren Ranko was a co-curator of Code Red, and there's a really strong community of Wabanaki people who are very focused on environmental issues, social justice issues, and all kinds of things. So I think there's a lot, and there's places like the Wabanaki Alliance that you can look for more information on that. But we just have a couple more minutes left. I'm mindful that you have another meeting to get to, and you have the world to save, as we all do. You're delegating us on that path too.
I'm off virtually to Colorado in a minute, so it'll be
yeah. So what words of wisdom would you send us folks off with? You know, again, not everybody's a revolutionary, not everybody's an activist, but the simple things that we can and should do in our lives to contribute to this effort.
Well, as I say, I mean, people know what to do around your house or your community, and that's all good. But you do have to be a citizen too here now. This is going to depend, the outcome of this is going to depend on citizens. And we cannot indulge in the kind of, I mean, you know, one presidential election ago, we elected a president who said that climate change was a hoax invented by the Chinese. I mean, if you were sitting on a public bus next to someone muttering that, you'd get up and change seats, you know? We can't indulge ourselves like that anymore. We actually really have to grapple with these things in serious ways. And so, you know, if for some reason you've been keeping your powder dry, now is the moment. we're out of spare years here. And you know, we should have, the terrors of the year past, including that endless plume of smoke down from the wildfires of Canada, should be enough to remind us that that it's now or never, and the possibilities are very clear. There's many, many, many things we can do, and we're starting to do them. It's going to take pressure in Augusta. It's going to take pressure in Washington. It's going to take pressure globally. And the only people that can apply it are us. That's why we build things like 350.org or Third Act, to allow people to combine their efforts enough to make change happen. And, you know, as student of history, you know that there are occasional great people like Greta Thunberg and things who rise up, but you also know that history is basically the story of what large numbers of people decide to do, and how they come together to make those things happen. So now is the time. It really is. And what a pleasure to get to think about it in the context of a place as beautiful and as rich in history, and as diverse in topography and landscape and culture as Maine. Um, I don't know if people still say like they used to, as Maine goes, so goes the nation. But let us hope, because I think as those wind turbines rise off the coast, it'll be a beacon for the rest of the country to be doing the right thing.
Bill, I can't tell you how much we appreciate you taking the time to spend with us thinking and talking about Maine, for all the work you do in your career to look out for the rest of us and look out for the planet. Really appreciate that, and again, your contribution to Code Red. So thank you for giving us your time and your efforts. And I think that notion of agency. We all have control, and we all have something to contribute. This is our world. However
Amen.
engaged.
Amen.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you.
brother.
Take care.
Take
Thanks
care,
everybody
man.
for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you again soon. And come to Code Red.